I think Edward was the most influential. I think Edward was more influential than Jimi Hendrix.
Hey guitar friends, Martin Smith here. I hope you're doing really well. I recently had the huge honour to sit with guitar journalist and author Steve Rosen. Steve got in touch about the channel and I was really keen to ask him to come on so we could drill down a little deeper into the things that made Ed the player and the man he was. So I really hope you enjoy this. If you do, press like and subscribe. I began by asking Steve, now the dust settled on the book and a few years have passed, does he still have outstanding questions for Ed?
Oh man, that's an excellent question. Firstly, it's wonderful meeting you, man. I came across one of your podcasts, and you were talking about Edward's songwriting. I thought, wow, man, I've never seen anybody else do that. And I have always remarked on Edward's sound, his songwriting, his composing, his sense of harmony. Everybody obviously talks about the guitar playing and that type of thing, and the riffs and stuff, but very few people kind of get into the actual songwriting aspect, and again, real quickly, so early on he was taking piano. He actually played also violin, and so even though Edward will say, well, I really didn't learn anything, this and that, I think that just subconsciously soaked in, and he was sharing those classical composer changes and final cadences and things, and I think that all sunk in. But in answer to your question, Martin, were there things I wish I could ask? Oh man, people ask questions. Well, did you talk to him about Randy Rhoads? That's a big one. And I go, oh man, that was a real sort of a missing piece. I think there's one little part in there where it's just part of a different interview. It's not even an interview, focused on Randy or other guitar players. And, I can't remember my exact words, but, what about Randy Rhoads? And he said some mildly generous things. I've heard from various people, some people who knew Randy really well, that they didn't have a very harmonious relationship, that they, sort of respected each other. I think, in my mind, I think it came from ultimate respect and jealousy. I think they were each jealous of each other.
Yeah.
But yes, I wish I had spoken to him more about Randy Rhoads. So let me just backtrack just a little bit, Martin. So back in 1986, I asked Edward, look, man, writers are going to come out of the woodwork. They're going to want to write your life story. I would like to be the person to do that. And he said, yes, I can't imagine anybody else. So that was an amazing feeling in and of itself. So I began interviewing, all the people who were in Edward's world, obviously the band, so I sat down with Alex and did some long interviews, and Mike, boyhood friends and people who are promoting shows, blah, 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 and putting all this together. But I knew that I had to sit with Edward to get more of all this missing information. Look, I had done a lot of interviews with him by then, for Guitar World and for actually a lot of UK magazines, Japanese magazines. So I had sort of that guitar thing settled, but no one knew about, well, Ed, what was it like when you were a kid? And were you a good student? And when did you get your first bicycle? And what was it like growing up in Europe? And, what was the relationship like with you and Alex? And I knew I had to get that stuff from him, because that's the kind of a book I wanted to write. I didn't want it to be sort of just a guitar-centric book.
Yeah.
So it was all those questions that I always wanted to ask, which I never got a chance to.
Right.
We all know that book never happened because with Edward, it was, well, man, the times, and his famous phrase was, man, the time's not right. Which I completely understood. Yeah. He will sit down now to write it. What about the next album that I'm working on? I didn't have an answer. when would you ever stop making music, right?
Yeah.
And then he came up with an idea. Well, why don't we do it? Because this is after Sammy had joined the band. Why don't we do 2 books? I thought, oh my God, what an amazing idea. So from the beginning to 1984, and then from Sammy 51, 50 hours, I thought that was amazing. Well, obviously that never happened. But in answer to your question, Martin, it was all of those early things that I wanted to ask him about. And it was just other guitar players in general. I mean, I really wanted to go into even deeper dives about Clapton and Jeff Beck, who said he really did listen a lot to. He loved the blow-by-blow stuff, but never really listened to, kind of Truth and Beckola with the Rod Stewart bit, which I thought was kind of incredible because he was a huge Cactus fan.
Yeah.
And that Cactus and Jim McCarty, was a monster fan of Jeff Beck. And I know that he listened to those early Beck records. So I thought that was a little strange. And Edward never professed to being a big Hendrix fan. I thought, well, that was weird. So it was all of those little pieces,
Yeah.
When I got done with the book, and it took 14 months to write, which is a very long time, at least I thought so.
Yeah.
I had written 7 books previously, and I think the longest one took like 3 months. So 14 months was a pretty long, exercise.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd done a good job, but then I'm probably my own worst critic, and I go, oh man, why didn't you ask him more about that? And why didn't you ask him more about that? So there are some missing pieces, but yeah, I did the best job I could. I've tried to put up on my YouTube page interviews that maybe fill in some of those holes. Some of his friends and early acquaintances, who kind of fill in a little bit of that story. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
And did you feel that Alex's book, Brothers, has filled in a little bit more of that background that you weren't able to cover with Ed?
It did. Honestly, look, I thought it was a very good book. I know it was probably an incredibly difficult book for him to write. I was hoping for more. I was hoping for more of that early stuff.
Yeah.
Because in truth, I mean, he is the last storyteller, right? Who else knows that story, right?
Yeah.
The parents are gone. There are no other brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
I was thinking, well, maybe there are some relatives that were living back in Amsterdam or various parts. And if there are, I mean, they would certainly be pretty old by now.
Yeah.
So he was the last keeper of those tales. I was just hoping it would go deeper.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying in any way that my interview that I did with Alex in '86 went deeper, but I thought that. So I mentioned earlier about interviewing the band for what was going to be the Outdoors biography. Alex kindly sat down with me. I think it was over the course of 2 days, and we did about 4 hours.
Oh wow.
Which turned into like a 6-part interview, which has gone up on my YouTube page. And I know that it's the deepest dive he's ever taken. And there's some pretty remarkable revelations in there. And he's talking about some of those early days when they were kids and stuff. So I did get some of that out. I liked Alex's book. I just thought it could have gone deeper.
Yeah, yeah. As ever, we want more from the story, don't we? We want to... I think it's testament to Ed's legend and what he left us with, that we just can't get enough of the background story, working out how this guy arrived from those beginnings. I can't get enough of that story. Now, you were already a guitar journalist when you first met Ed, I understand, and a female friend introduced you guys, and you met him at a nightclub. Is that correct?
That is correct. So I began writing, and I've always tried to figure out when it was. I always thought it was in '73, probably early to mid '73, but it could have been as early as late 1972.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I've been writing. So I meet Edward in July 1977 at the Whiskey. So let's call it 73. Let's call it 4 years.
Yeah.
So I've been writing for about 4 years. And yes, I had interviewed some pretty heavy musicians by then. I started writing for a guitar player in mid '73. My first story in Guitar Player was Jeff Beck, wow, which became a cover in December '73, and that was my first cover.
The big start.
Unbelievable start. I mean, Beck was, in all transparency here, I mean, and I said it before, he was my favorite guitar player of all time.
Yeah.
I think he was the greatest who ever lived. I think Edward was the most influential. I think Edward was more influential than Jimi Hendrix, because Edward really grew up more in the digital age. So now you have access to, 100 million people as opposed to Jimmy sort of, in an analog world, being able to reach, a much more limited audience. But yeah, so starting with Jeff Beck was pretty amazing. But then over the years, before meeting Edward, I'd interviewed the guys at Wishbone Ash. I loved Wishbone Ash. I thought they were an amazing band. John Entwistle, Ronnie Wood, John McLaughlin, Joe Walsh, and I was writing for Cream magazine and Circus, which were more kind of, sex, drug, and rock and roll mags, but very cool back in the day.
Yeah.
So I had done some pretty cool interviews before meeting Edward. Right. So I'm there at the Whiskey. It's a Friday night, 1977, and Cheap Trick is recording a live record. This is like a promo record, probably that the label wanted maybe just to hand out to media or radio stations just to get the word out. Because in '77, Cheap Trick weren't a household word. The next year they would record Budokan and become huge. So this is just kind of a little, over the course of a weekend, hey, let's record a live album with Cheap Trick at the Whiskey. So I thought, well, my gosh, that's worth checking out. So I was there with my brother Mick, and we're waiting for Cheap Trick to come on, and there's a tap on my shoulder, and it's Michelle Meyer. Michelle was this incredible girl, who booked the Whiskey. I call her a yenta, and a yenta is sort of a Yiddish word for somebody who just kind of gossips, but knows everything that's going on. And she did. She knew everything that was going on in Hollywood that was worth knowing. And she said, listen, there's somebody upstairs that you should meet. And I thought, well, if Michelle wants me to meet somebody, I mean, there's no questions asked. Who is it, Michelle? Let's go. I owed her. I loved her. I had a band at the time called Deluge, and she would book me into little, clubs that she booked some clubs outside of the Whiskey, so I would do anything for her. Mm-hmm. And so we go up the stairs to the dressing rooms at the Whiskey, and they are, they're pretty historic. All the walls are covered in graffiti, all the bands that have been there. I mean, there's probably some pretty famous scrawl up there, right? Because everybody from Cream to Zeppelin to Alice Cooper, everybody had played the Whiskey at one time or another. And it kind of reeked of cigarettes, and the carpeting was like, you didn't want to look too closely. Who knows what was going to come oozing up out of there. And so we walk up the stairs, and walk into one of the dressing rooms. And I look in the corner, and there's this kind of a tall, lanky guy in the corner smoking a cigarette. So you have to remember that July '77, there are no stories about Van Halen. There are no magazines reporting about the band. In fact, the only pictures I can remember seeing of them are the flyers that they would, literally post up and down Sunset Boulevard.
Right.
And they also go to concerts and slip them inside, car windshields, and that was how they promoted the band.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty positive I had seen those flyers. I had seen a picture of him, and I'm pretty certain I kind of knew who he was. However, the real caveat was I had never heard Van Halen play before meeting him.
Right.
And I don't know how that happened, because I was at the Whiskey and the Starwood a lot during that period. I mean, weekly, multiple times. So how I miss Van Halen, I don't know. Anyway, so we go over, and she goes, Eddie Van Halen, Steve Rosen, Eddie Van Halen, Godhead. And Michelle calling you Godhead was ultimate praise. That was, God on high. That was the absolute summit. You were the greatest, and that was only reserved for the truly, legends,
Right.
And we just start talking, and I don't know, man, and I don't want to romanticize it, but it was a truly enlightened conversation. It was so comfortable. And again, I prefaced it with, I had met a lot of other guitar players by then. So it's not like I was sort of a deer in the headlights meeting him. But then again, I didn't really know who he was, other than he was in a local band who had gotten a deal on Warner Brothers. I knew that. So anyway, so we're talking, and Eric Clapton comes up. And I go, God, I love Clapton. I love Cream and John Mayall, and he was all those blues bands prior to Mayall. I mean, I knew a lot about Eric Clapton. And whenever I'd have a conversation with someone, it was always sort of, well, if Clapton comes up, and if you make a comment about Clapton that I deem is below my intelligence threshold, I'm going to dismiss you out of band. So if you make some dumb comment or something that I think is dumb, it's like, dude, you really don't know anything about Eric, so
yeah,
waste my time. And not that I wanted it to happen or was waiting for it to happen, but I just figured, yeah, he knew about Clapton and, as a surface thing. But what what Edward was talking about was Eric's actual playing.
Yeah.
And the tone, and you go, yeah, man, listen to this, and his vibrato. And I thought, oh my God, this guy's going a step deeper than I ever could. I mean, I understood it sort of intrinsically. I played guitar not very well, so I understood it on that level, but I never could have verbalized it like that. So he really understood,
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought, oh my gosh, this is so freaking cool to meet someone who knows that much. And then we start talking about Jeff Beck, and then Richie Blackmore comes up. I mean, those are my favorite guitar players, and they were Edward's favorite guitar players. And all the time I remember very, very clearly, he was smoking, and he'd smoke, and and it's like filling up around me. And I write about it in Tonechaser. Cigarette smoke is one of the huge catalysts for people who suffer from migraines, and I had migraines at the time.
Oh.
And I'm thinking, the cigarette smoke is permeating my clothes, and it's getting into my nose, and it was kind of noxious, but, the conversation was so amazing. So we're talking, and I'm trying to remember how long it was. I think it was a pretty long conversation. It could have been like an hour.
Okay.
And then he runs out of the room, He doesn't say anything, he just runs out of the room. And he comes back, and he's got a pen. And he picks up some, piece of paper off the carpeted floor, and he's writing something down, and he hands it to me, and it's his phone number.
Wow. And
he goes, well, man, I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope we can talk again.
Amazing.
And that was the first meeting. It was amazing.
That is incredible. And then from there, you then heard Van Halen subsequently. You heard the band on record after that point.
I did. And, and people get mad at me because I did see them live before hearing the record. And so at that point, they were still, even though they were signed, they were still playing the whiskey. So it must have been at a whiskey show I saw them. And honestly, the only thing I can remember about the show, and people get mad, well, how can you not remember everything about, seeing Van Halen for the first time? Well, and I try to explain, I was seeing a lot of shows, and not that seeing Van Halen for the first time wasn't incredibly important, but, it was just hard to remember.
Yeah.
What I remember is he had that big hollowed out bomb on stage, and I remember him turning around multiple times during the show and playing. And I wasn't sure why. Later I would understand, well, when he would do the tapping thing, he would turn around because he didn't want anybody to see what he was doing.
Yeah.
Which I always thought was remarkable because you could see exactly what he was doing. And since then, 1,000 guitar players have, incorporated tapping, and no one does it like Edward. But, yes.
Apart from Wolfie.
I'm sorry?
Apart from Wolfie. Wolfie seems to do it like Edward.
Exactly. Wolf certainly has it down.
Yeah.
So then we fast forward, was it 8 months, February 78, the first record comes out. And to make a long story short, so I get the first Van Halen record from Warner Brothers. I was on mailing lists. So each month you would get all these new releases from these labels, which was an unbelievable, some of the swag you would get for free as a starving journalist, right? And I'm looking through, I remember there was a Little Feat record, there was a Manfred Mann record, and there's a Van Halen record. I go, oh my God, that's that guy on that. That's the band, I put it on, and I'll make this story short. I didn't think it was very good. I was not impressed. I thought, it sounds like Deep Purple, but not done as well. Those fast shuffles, I thought, Rosen, you have to be missing something, because every other writer, every other person on the planet says this is the second coming. So I went back the next day and really sat down and listened carefully, and that's when I got it. That was my aha moment. I go, oh my God, that was that guy I was speaking to, and he was so humble and modest, and yeah.
That's really interesting, because there's a recording engineer producer called Susan Rogers. She was the engineer on all the Prince and the Time albums. She's a professor now, and she does a lot of work in the field of musical connections. And she's worked out that when people hear something new for the first time, there's no connection pathway. And so that new thing gets rejected occasionally. And then the next time you go back to it, you'll have formed a neural network, and the thought goes through, and you accept it a bit more. I wonder if there's something about Edward's approach to guitar that was quite new to all the other guitarists around at the time, that needed a new sort of formulation in your brain, a new pathwork.
Right. What a wonderful question and theory. And I do believe it when I think back on it now. Yes, I think it was all of that. In my mind, I was thinking, well, he's gonna, sort of sound like, maybe he's gonna have some of that bluesy Clapton thing, or it'll be some of the, whammy bar from Beck and Ritchie. And it was really none of those things. And on the other side of that, it was my own, for want of a better description, my own shortcomings as a listener and being an open-minded lover of music. Because I loved those guitar players from sort of the late 60s, and Jeff Beck and Schauer and Kossoff and David Gilmour is a little bit later. Clapton and Beck and Page and Hendrix. I mean, that's what my mind and that's what my ears were tuned to. I mean, I had seen all those bands live, and they were extraordinary moments for me. So maybe I was afraid somewhere deep inside that, oh my God, if I really allow this Edward Van Halen to be that great in my mind, then what happens to all my heroes?
Yeah.
Are they going to hear? Is anybody ever going to listen to the Truth record again? So I think about that, and I wrote about that.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out, well, why was my first my initial feelings about the record like that? But as you say, it was a physiological thing, which I truly believe, because I can remember hearing albums that will become classics for me the first time, and there were moments. I mean, I remember hearing the first Zeppelin record. I remember hearing Good Times, Bad Times, and then immediately I thought, oh my God, this is unbelievable. But the rest of the record was like, yeah, it's good. But then you go back, and so I really believe that. I mean, it'd be amazing to see that charted at, when they do the, when they put your head and they do the thing and show some listening or attach electrodes and put a Beatles song, for the first time and then the second time. What an amazing thought, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So that's really interesting. And also, like, it was the start of what we now call the Brown sound. And I view that as the first 6 Van Halen albums. Things changed in the Sammy era and things got more sort of harmonised, and it sort of lost what I found to be the most honest and true part of his sound. But I went back recently and listened to all the releases from sort of 76 to 78 in the rock world in America. And I didn't hear anybody who sounded remotely like Edward. All the guitar sounds that were Marshall, big distortion sounds, they were loose and airy and kind of sizzle. I don't know, there was a strange airiness, but when you heard Edward, it sounded compacted. It sounded like it was carved out of rock. It wasn't loose and buzzy and ephemeral. It was very, very together. And I don't know if that was a shock to you as a listener of guitar rock at the time, the actual sonics of it.
Right, what an amazing idea. Martin, I'm going to ask you a question. I mean, do you remember, or can you tell me who some of those guitar players were?
Yeah.
I mean, some of the bands?
I tried to listen to pretty much all the rock releases. So, I mean, it was anything from Kiss through to Peter Frampton. I tried to listen to Angel because I know that Ed hung out with those guys. So I listened to pretty much all the rock releases that were on the major American labels. But yeah, the guitar sounds were always loose and buzzy compared to what Ed brought about on that first album. It just seemed to be tighter, more cohesive, just a sharper approach. It's very difficult to describe a sound, isn't it? It's like dancing about architecture, as they say.
No, that's what an interesting idea. I absolutely agree. And maybe it was that kind of a sonic tone that he had that my brain couldn't kind of figure out what that was.
Yeah.
Right, because if you go way back, I mean, again, if you talk about Beck's sound, which is a Les Paul and Marshall, right? Mm-hmm. On those early records, I mean, it's really airy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary guitar sounds, but it has no similarity to what Edward was doing.
No.
Or Blackmore sound again, with the Strat and a Marshall even closer to what Ed was doing, right, with his hybrid Strats. All those guitar sounds, back in the day. I mean, Kossoff and Trower, back with Procol Harum. I mean, entirely different.
Yeah, and yet they were using the same gear ostensibly. They were using Path humbuckers and a Marshall head.
Exactly.
So it's pretty crazy how he managed to get it to sound completely different.
It is, and I think the next logical step to take is, as we all know, is being an amazing guitar player. That it comes from the hands.
Yeah.
So and I'll give one little example of this. Again, I write about it in the book in Tonechaser. Edward was coming over to my little guest house. I lived about 10 minutes away from Edward. Edward lived in Coldwater Canyon, which was the expensive part, and I lived in Laurel Canyon, the Hollywood Hills, which was the bohemian, $100 a month log cabin part. So he would just come over. I don't know if you're a Seinfeld fan, but it would be the popover, right? He'd just show up unannounced, Wow. And obviously it was always amazing when he would do that. So I remember one day, and I'll try to abbreviate this. So he shows up, and he's just bought his 2 Les Pauls, and he brought them over. Literally, I believe he had just bought them literally an hour before. Wow. And so he brought them over. He wanted to show them to me, which I thought was amazing. So, he's looking, I'm looking at them, and I had a Marshall stack at the time. In '76, I'd gone to England with my friend Niels Lothauer, the Van Halen photographer, and we hung out for about a week, and we actually did an interview. I did an interview with Jim Marshall.
Wow.
We were invited out to the Marshall factory, and we took some pictures. Jim sold me a stack, which was the most extraordinarily generous thing to do. So I had an entire Marshall 100 stack there. So I'm standing in the corner. So at one point he stands up, or I think I'd actually asked him, because I don't think he was sort of just going to do it, which was odd. There's a Marshall stack there, and he's got these 2 Les Pauls, and he wasn't sort of desirous of plugging in.
Yeah.
But I think I wanted him to plug in, of course. So he goes and he plugs one of them in, and it's funny because it had a master volume. But he goes, well, how does the master volume work? And I go, I didn't know anything. I couldn't get a good tone, man, if you plug me into the greatest guitar amp in the world. I was just me and my hands, I go, I don't know. Yeah. And, in 2 minutes he figured it out. But, literally he does a Spinal Tap thing and rolls his hand across all the volume. Seriously. Everything, volume 10, treble, bass, presence. And he plays for about, 20 or 25 seconds. And it is, it's just amazing. It's amazing. And But he says, it was okay. I mean, he wasn't rude about it, but I could tell he thought it sucked. He goes, "Oh man, you got to play through some of my amps." But in answer to your question, yes, I agree with that idea of the sound was unique, and maybe that's why I couldn't process that. But hearing him play, through this guitar which he had never played before, Les Paul with humbuckers, through my Marshall amp that he'd never played before. I mean, it was still there.
Yeah. Okay.
That is unbelievable because, real quickly, so he came out of doing all of those, backyard parties in Pasadena, playing Gazzarri's, where he had to learn all these cover songs, right? So they were playing songs from everybody from James Brown to Cream and Purple and Sabbath and Spirit and Mountain, So he was hearing all of those guitar players, and yet to hear all of that input, and yet to create this sound, this brown sound that sounded nothing like them, and it going even a step further, building his own guitar, because he was hearing this sound in his head that he couldn't capture. And he talked about it because very early on, there are pictures of Edward playing, a Strat. That wasn't doing it for him. No. So hearing all that and sitting down and creating an instrument to convey the sound in your head. I mean, to me, that's like, right? That's alien. That's like, oh my God, that's otherworldly. Right?
That's incredible, isn't it? I was reading, and maybe it was in Alex's book, but I read that the boys would sit with the father, Jan, while he sanded his reeds for his clarinets when they were really young. And he was doing that to get better tone from the clarinet, a warmer, browner sound. And I think Jan's the father of the brown sound for me. Because if the kids sat with him and watched this practice, then they'd want to go and use their instruments to be modified, and perfect their sound too. So maybe Jan's the father of that.
Yeah, man. Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I know that, for Edward, Jan was his whole world, and again, I hate to keep referencing the book, but his relationship with his mother, look, it was his mother, he loved her, but I don't think it was anything like the relationship with Jan, so like that's a moment I would love to have spoken to Edward about. Hey man, you sat there and you saw your dad, sanding down his reeds, at the beginning of you as, guitar luthier and, designing your own thing and wanting to change.
Yeah, it's the family way, I guess, isn't it?
Exactly.
One thing I noticed about your tone in the book is, certainly from the early interviews, you're sat with Edward in a room. He's trying to be a humble, kind of personable guy, and you're sort of trying to be inquisitive as to his level. But in the middle of it, there's a huge elephant, which is his talent. And it must have been really hard to negotiate that huge, world-changing ability, just as two guys sat around shooting the shit.
It was extraordinarily difficult. And I love that question because that's really, it was finding that balance in the book. And I think maybe that's part of why it took me, certainly one of the major reasons why it took me 17 years to even sit down to write the book. So I stopped saying Edward in 2003. The friendship sort of ends, and I don't want to give the book away, but it sort of ends. I think about the book off and on. I don't want to make it sound like, every day I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, we no longer hang out and the biography is never going to happen. It never happened. I don't want it to sound like every day I was commiserating about that.
No.
But I thought about it. Quite a bit. As the years went by, the thoughts would dissipate a little bit, but it never left my mind. So 17 years later, for various reasons, at the urging of some friends, they say, hey, why don't you write a book? I sit down and write the book. But before I wrote word one, and I thought about that, and especially when I started listening back to some of the interviews, and it put me back in that place and time, and I thought to myself, my God, you know, look how lucky you were. I was lucky to be there, and then it went beyond that, because I talked earlier about being my own worst critic. It's like, why me?
Yeah.
Of all the people he could have been friends with in this world, and I'm not saying he didn't have other very close friends, I'm not saying that, but why me? Why would he have allowed me to write his book back in the day, and so all of that permeates every single word I write. And I'm thinking, how do I write this book in such a way where it doesn't sound like I'm just a hanger-on or trying to suck his blood or take something from him. And even then, as I'm hearing the interviews and I remember the moment sitting there in the room with him, and I write about it a lot, it wasn't an easy thing to do. I mean, it really was sort of walking a tightrope. Never for 1 minute did I ever sort of lose sight of the fact that I was sitting there with, the modern day Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix. I mean,
right.
I knew that at every moment I was with him. On the other side of that, because I did spend a lot of time with him, excuse me, where we were doing, interviews for Guitar Mags, Guitar World. I probably did about, besides the 3 covers that I did with him, 84, 85, 86, I mean, there's probably another, half a dozen kind of features, the Brian May project, hanging out in his, workshop, there's a NAMM story. I went to the NAMM show with Edward in New Orleans, which is pretty incredible.
Wow.
So there were a lot of those moments, and really those were sort of, not that they were easy, but they were certainly less stressful.
Yeah.
Because, now we're really talking about guitars and Edward, the new record and those types of things. It was some of the other conversations where it was just kind of 2 people talking, and it would get personal. And honestly, he was much more forthright with his life than I was with mine.
Right.
He was open with his feelings, and I mean, I was pretty honest with him, but he would tell me things, and most of it's in the book. And it was amazing. It was not easy walking that tightrope.
No.
Because early on, because I mean, your first instinct, my first instinct is to scour him with accolades and, oh my God, Edward, listen, what you did on that first record, and all the things that we want to say that we would say to him. Yeah. I did that a little bit, and he wasn't offended, but it didn't mean anything to him.
Yeah.
His response was sort of neutral and kind of like, okay, so I tried to learn early on not to do that, not to be a sycophant and go gushing over what he was doing or what he had done, and try to just not consciously think, well, if we're just hanging out, I'm just trying to be a friend, how would you act around a friend who just happened to be an amazing, amazing, world-changing guitar player, And that wasn't easy to do.
No.
And I again, man, in the book, it was really difficult trying to describe those moments where you're trying, so I'm trying to describe this moment of this Steve Rosen character sitting there with Edward Van Halen, and what was Steve Rosen feeling like, and what was Edward Van Halen feeling, and what was that dynamic like, and it was hard.
Yeah.
It was sort of, everything became heightened.
Yeah.
Like we're on drugs. I mean, and I write about doing drugs with him. I mean, let's be honest,
Yeah.
And those were fun moments. I don't think I ever actually sat there when I had to do sort of an interview for a magazine where I'd been high, because I just didn't think I would be capable of doing it. I would have started blabbing, and at the end of the day, I'd listen to a cassette that there was nothing on it. So that would never happen. But even in those sober moments, man, it was just heightened. Like,
yeah,
there was something about the guy, and I really describe it. And I don't want to sound all spiritual and all new agey, but he really did radiate this positive energy.
Yeah.
I mean, he did, he was always so supportive. And it comes out in some of these conversations, which I call the Twilight Tapes, because typically they'd happen either late at night if I was up at 5150, we're just hanging out, or he would call me, and I'd be feeling kind of weird or down, and he would say these amazing things.
Yeah.
And I try to be that kind of a buffer for him and try to make him feel better about things. And he talks about his dad passing, and I knew how that must have felt, because my mom had passed away, and I know what that feeling is. It was not easy.
No.
And, a couple of times, like I said, I would say some things to him, and he just kind of, okay. In his head, that humility and that honesty and thinking that you could understand who this Edward Van Halen character was, that was all real.
Yeah.
That was not false humility. You see that, and I've experienced that a lot in other musicians, where they think to you, but dude, I know who you are. I know what you're like. You really don't feel that way.
No. No.
Edward, it was really true.
Yeah.
However, on the other hand, there will be times, when I try to restrain myself and not say something, when my first instinct was to be, oh my God, that, the solo on that song, or your sound, or my God, your playing, or your feel on that was, was not to go overboard.
Yeah.
And I remember it was a solo in one of the songs, and it's in the book, and I can't remember the song. And he brings it up. And for him to bring up the solo means he was really proud of us.
Yeah.
And so, in me trying to take a step backward, I go, it was good. And he goes, well, didn't you think it was good? I thought it was really neat. And for him to say it was neat, meaning he thought it was really something incredible for him,
Yeah.
I go, no, man, it was amazing. It was amazing.
Yeah.
So if I step too far the other way, he would respond to it, which comes out in my mind, which is why I love the guy so much, about respect.
Yeah.
Respect was everything to him. And respect didn't mean that I had to sit there, or that anybody had to sit there and shower him with these compliments.
No.
And he talks about it over and over. And there's some interviews, and I don't know who did them. Well, what do you think about being called a guitar hero? He hated that.
Yeah.
He, that's and I never called him a guitar hero. It was sort of referenced once. We were talking, it was just one of the questions in a sort of a multi-subject conversation we had, that he had then won 5 guitar player pulls in a row.
Yeah.
And he goes, yeah, I won 5 in a row, And he said something about, yeah, it's pretty cool. I go, yeah, man, you can't win anymore. And he thought that was funny.
Yeah.
Way that him recognizing, yes, I recognize that I've won 5 in a row. But he would never say to you, hey, man, I won 5 freaking guitar player pulls in a row. Who else has done that? I mean, I'm better than these. That never came out.
No.
So the fact that he would respect me enough to be a little bit shaken by the fact that I wasn't blown away by this solo was just remarkable, and it said again, it just reiterated how incredible he was. And that, from his point of view, I was just this guy, and I don't know if he ever really understood what it was I did as a music journalist. I mean, he knew I interviewed people. And when he'd come over to the house, and you can see from the pictures here, he'd look at the pictures and he'd ask me about somebody, and he'd think it was cool, but that had nothing to do with why we were friends. I mean, and I thought it was.
Yeah.
Would be legitimate. The fact that I did know these other people and I had hung out, I thought that legitimized me. I don't think that ever meant anything to him.
No.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it. So, Martin, you said it's difficult to define what that was and how the interaction and how I acted. I can tell you that it was not easy, and I was always aware of who he was. I sometimes tried to be my own monitor by not going overboard, but my feelings about him were all real. And when we had these conversations, it was all genuine. And if he was in a great mood, I felt that and tried to encourage that, of course, when he was feeling down. But it was amazing. And what made my relationship, and for that reason alone, what made my relationship with Edward different than all these other guitar players I met was that I didn't have this relationship with them.
No.
I wasn't spending all these hours. Now, there were some people that I spent a fair amount of time with. Steve Lukather I knew pretty well, and he didn't live far away. And, I would go over to his house and do interviews, and I interviewed him many times. But it was nothing like Edward.
No.
So, how do people act, assistants to movie stars and athletes? I cannot believe for a moment they are ever unaware that they're working for, Robert De Niro or pick someone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it must be difficult.
Yeah, it must be. And I think in your conversations, a lot of the time, I'm struck by Edward's. He's sort of he's emotionally available all the time, and that can have its good side and its bad side. And sometimes he would perhaps detect that there was a negative opinion when there wasn't one. He would sometimes be, oh really? He'd be thrown off by a comment, and I found that really interesting. He was quite vulnerable, wasn't he? There was no sort of defence there that would stop these things getting through. They'd get straight through to his skin, and he'd be like, "What do you mean by that?" Was that difficult to negotiate as well? He could get sort of offended or brusque sometimes.
That was really difficult. That's another great question. And again, trying to be hyper aware of that, because I recognized that early on. And again, it comes down to this respect thing, and just respect Edward Van Halen, and he will never forget about it.
Right.
He might deal with it, but it always lingers there. And yes, that happened a few times where I made what I thought was an innocuous comment, or not comment about something, and that would bother him. He was, and I think I used the word in the book, he was really fragile.
Yeah.
And maybe all artists at that level, I don't know.
I think that's I think it's the entrance price, really, to conduct that much artistry. You need to be available to it at all times, which is a really hard thing to do, isn't it?
Exactly. I agree with that. It did happen a few times, not many times, where I would say something that would bother him, or I would act in a certain way. There was one conversation, this is really personal, where it was right around Christmas time, and I was feeling Christmas blues, and he was saying all the right things, but I think deep down it was like, well, why is he feeling like this? He shouldn't feel like that. I think it bothers him, but he would never say that like that. But he tried to boo me, And remember one time he said, well, hey man, just go home and play music, but don't take drugs. I thought, wow, for him to really sense that I would go, bury the feelings that way.
Yeah.
It, was really hypersensitive of him. So I was really aware of it.
Yeah.
So let's explode that out a little bit and talk about the band dynamics. And again, the key word here is respect. And so, what were those interactions like between Edward and Alex? It was this blood bond,
right?
And nothing Alex could have done or said was going to ever break that. But, Michael and Dave were band members, right? They weren't blood. And what was that relationship like? Well, Edward talked to me about it. And with Michael, he said, I love him. I really do love him like a brother. But I think he could bring more to the band. And that translates into disrespect. And look, Mike did everything he could for the band, right? Yeah. But Edward wanted more. And over time that builds, and I guess it festered. Yeah. And, we saw the result of that. Yeah. And with Dave, it was the same thing. Dave wanted to go do a solo record. Edward's all for it. Yeah. Hey, man, go get your yayas out. But Dave took that a step further, and certainly Dave's prerogative. I think the way he did it was pretty shitty. He wanted to go pursue a solo career. But that disrespect was there for a lot, from the beginning. Edward and Dave were never friends. And so I don't think those guys, I don't know if Michael and Dave on that level were that hyper aware of this vulnerability, this fragility, this sensitivity that Edward had. However, he was, and I don't want to, again, these are my thoughts, and I don't think I ever even voiced them in the book, but yes, he was, I asked him once, if you weren't Edward Van Halen, out there looming large in the world, what would you be doing? I'd still be playing the whiskey. And in that response, it says, I truly believe that he could not have done anything else.
Right.
There are many instances when I was with him, and this is sort of a peripheral sort of connection, where he would take the path of least resistance.
Right.
And that's by way of saying, all he knew was sitting there in his room, playing guitar 10 hours a day, being out in the studio, recording 8 million new song ideas, going on the road, coming back and writing records.
Yeah.
You never saw him out. He didn't go to a ton of concerts. You never saw his picture, online and stuff. But when I talk about path of least resistance, when he was looking for a new singer, and I write about it in the book, he says, "Hey man, find me a new singer." It's like, I'm thinking, it's like Van Gogh, "Hey man, go find me some new paintbrushes." Right, like you can't go find your own paintbrushes. I truly believe that his thought process were, he didn't, I don't think he connected the dots about how you would go about looking through a Rolodex and finding singers and setting up auditions, or how do I find a singer I like? I really believe that was beyond him.
Right.
In some remarkable way. When they get the new manager, Ed Leffler, who was an important piece of that Van Halen success, I mean, he really brought that band together, passes away, and they bring in Sammy's manager.
Yeah.
Why on this earth would you bring in a manager who was managing the singer you're bringing into your band?
Yeah.
All right? I mean, it's like a football player bringing in the coach who's going to coach the team. It's just unheard of. I've never heard of it happening before. No. Why would you do that? Because I'm thinking, you don't understand how to go find a manager? You don't talk to your friends, Warner Brothers, about... And those moments, it's like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
When he was going to endorse Kramer, I was up there that night, and again, I write about it, and it's an extraordinary night. He asked me, should I do this? And every instinct in me said, no, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. What good comes of it? It can't be for the money, right? Because he didn't need money at that point. What I should have said to him, what I should have said is, Edward, you could go to any guitar company in the world, tell them to make you 10 guitars to your specs, tell them that you'll allow them to put their name on the headstock, but that's it. You're not going to endorse anything. But he didn't do that. Look, I'm not trying to take away from the quality of the guitars that Kramer made. They must have been good or he wouldn't have played them. But why would he lend his name to them? And ultimately that blew up in his face because Dennis Berardi went out and found Steve Vai when Van Halen were in a little bit of a lull, which I found despicable. And Edward hated it too. So in answer to your question, yes, I think Edward was socially challenged in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I think that he learns to understand how to behave and act, but when he had to do NAMM shows where there'd be a line of people clamoring for his autographs, he would go get crazy. I mean, he would get really claustrophobic, right. And he'd pull back. I saw it multiple times. I took him to a concert to see Ritchie Blackmore with Rainbow, and I saw people recognize him because he was just in the audience. I saw people coming up to him, and I could see it. I saw him trying to shrink inside himself, and where did that come from? He didn't know how to react to it. He was totally uncomfortable. So, yes, I totally agree with that. I don't think that Edward had a lot of outside stimulus in a way, other than his own music. Right. I mean, I don't even to the point where he legitimately did not listen to a lot of outside music.
No, apparently not.
And again, I don't think his social circle was huge. So, yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think that he was a voracious reader. No. I don't think he had input that way. Look, I'm not saying he didn't read, but we never talked about a book or an author. No. I was shocked that he knew about sports. We actually went to a football game. I thought, my God, I never thought he knew about sports. He never talked about football or baseball or basketball. No. So yes, I agree with all that. And I think, that made him sort of, again, I hate to use the word childlike in some ways, but he was. Yeah. I mean, which attributes to that vulnerability and fragility. Everything that you said sort of found a place inside him. As a musician and composer, that's probably an amazing quality to have. As a human being out in the world, I don't think it's so great. So, right.
I think his speed, his intelligence and his speed on guitar, his thought speed as well, not just guitar speed, but the ability to think fast, seemed to exist just in the world of guitar. And when you took him outside of his goldfish bowl, the world was more challenging because he hadn't spent much time developing techniques to deal with it, perhaps. But within that guitar world, it was so developed, it's almost like you can't believe the guy wasn't more adept at other areas of his life. But it was just that one area, wasn't it? Just the music.
I do believe that. I remember Alex telling me sort of back in the day that Edward was he was a really good athlete, which I can imagine. I mean, he was always, kind of trim and svelte, and it was always kind of ripped and stuff. And he told me a lot of that came from jumping rope. That was his thing. Oh. You could have you would have thought, he would have gotten more into sports or working out or being, interested in athletic stuff or athletes, professional athletics, more. And he did a little bit. I mean, we hung out with Mark Gastineau, who was a defensive end on the New York Jets. Oh, wow. And they became friends. So Edward, I think he recognized, and I think I wrote about this. He recognized that rare gift, that excellence in other people like that. But being able to think so clearly and effortlessly, and the speed and putting all of those things together, which required such deep, obviously mental acuity and being able to write songs like that. Again, we started a conversation. You know, his songwriting.
Yeah.
I mean, you took a wonderful deep dive. His song structures didn't sound like anybody else, and I think that's because he tossed out the notion of look. He was hyper aware of this because he had done all those cover songs. He had heard 1,000 ZZ Top songs and you know, verse, bridge, chorus, B section.
Right.
But I don't think he ever really thought about that in his songwriting. But he was so brilliant at it. Though I think he worked very hard at it.
Okay.
Again, I had a rare opportunity. We were in Chicago. I flew out to Chicago to see a couple shows. After the show, we went back to his room, and he was working on a riff. And I wish I could remember the riff, because I'll bet you anything it was a riff that would appear on a record.
Right.
Because he tended not to just play some riff out in space, or he would never sort of play a Purple riff. You know, he never did that kind of thing.
No.
So a riff that he would play would be something that would ultimately end up somewhere, and I wish I could remember. But I remember him going over and over and over and refining it, and you know,
right.
cutting out a note or cutting out an accent or this and that. You know, so he did work hard on it, though it seemed to come effortlessly from him. So yes, I think that there was some kind of a social challenge.
Yeah.
You know, on some levels with him, and that he had just no desire or inclination to ever want to do anything else. You know?
If you could play, if you could play guitar that good, I wouldn't want to do anything else either.
You would think that, you know, and I mean, you think about guitar players, great guitar players. I mean, is that all they ever do? Is that all they ever wanted to do? Well, a lot of those brilliant guitar players, you know, write books, right? Brian May, you know, writes his book on the evolution of space or whatever his thing is. You know? A lot of them become artists, right? They want to do art.
Yeah.
They get into movies, you know, because of who they are. I mean, you know, all those doors open up. So there's something in them that needs to be fed from this other side.
Yeah. But you were talking about his composition. Something I noticed with Edward, which was different to the guitarists before and after him, was there was a choice about the chord voicings. Heavy metal players would do brutal power fifth chords. And when you got to like if you were playing A, B, C and putting power chords onto it, the heavy metal players would just do it as a brutal power fifth shape. And the classic rock guys would use more of a melodic approach. It was more sort of tempered and harmonically pleasing. But Ed could do both, and he did do both at different times. And I thought that was telling. It was like bridging two different styles of music, and he could effortlessly dip into either one of them at will, choosing, you know, the type of feeling he wanted for them. He had a lot of music to draw on, didn't he? And then there was the classical, and then there was the blues. And it all went into his pot, didn't it? And just got stirred around and made this fantastic stew.
Yeah, man, that is really so interesting because, you know, people always say, well, he loved Blackmore and Eric Clapton, you know. So where do you hear that in his playing? You know, you would tend to, you know, okay, let me listen to the solos. I'm going to hear it in some kind of a phrase, you know, that he does, you know. And I suppose your ears might be able to catch it, but truly, yes, it comes from, because Clapton had that thing too. You know, even with Cream, he was, you know, some of those songs off of Wheels of Fire. I mean, some of those voicings are pretty freaking hip. Edward would blend those two. You know, and now thinking about it, I mean, maybe that's why my ears tended to go towards those kinds of players. Because you think a lot of those guys actually had that. I mean, I think about Robin Trower, and I know I'm drifting a bit, but I think about Robin Trower on those Procol Harum records. You know, there's a lot of that classical stuff that Gary Brooker was playing on keyboards. And Robin did try to complement that. I mean, a lot of times you hear those amazing power chords from him. But other times, man, you hear that incredible, intricate picking stuff, and you know that those voicings are up and down the neck. Yes, and Edward did that all the time.
Yeah.
And that's where you hear, yes, the Clapton maybe coming out, or the Blackmore, that Jeff Beck stuff. Though he mentions he wasn't a Hendrix fan, maybe some of that Hendrix stuff, and certainly that ability to play sort of that rhythm and lead thing.
Yeah.
In one go, right? Those early records, right? The first record had no, overdub rhythm parts, except for I think JV's Client.
Yeah, there's a couple.
But obviously it's such an art in and of itself, because you're going from a rhythm thing to the solo. There's a big hole there, but obviously Clapton was a master of that with that live Cream stuff. I mean, God, it's just insane. But yeah, no, that's very true, and I think a lot of that did come from that classic thing, and seeing the those chords, written out on the piano, and him, maybe certainly not consciously, but it was up there in his brain pan. And how he gets those great voicings. I mean, I'd watch him do those things.
Oh, right.
And, they were weird. They were weird chords,
Really? Yeah.
And very, very cool theory, man.
Super duper. Well, what a rich thing. We could talk about this for, hours and hours. But Zoom's just given me another warning that we're about to get kicked off. So maybe this is a suitable place to close this little instalment of a conversation.
Yeah.
But that's been tremendous. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on Ed. Further to what you've already done in Tonechaser, which is an amazing book. I bought it as soon as I could get my mitts on it, and I don't want to finish it. However, I'm going very slowly through it. I don't want it to end. It's like living with him and a conversation that's still alive, as long as I don't finish the book. So I'm going slow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, very kind, man. Well, thank you so much, Martin. If you haven't heard the audiobook, I'll send you the audiobook.
Thank you.
Those are amazing. And just real quickly, a shameless plug, go check out the book at tonechaserbook.com. It's been an amazing conversation with you, Martin. Thank you so much. And we'll do a follow-up soon.
Thank you. Yeah, we definitely will, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, man.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it. You take care.
Ya.
All right.
Bye
Bye for now.